Back in the day, dinner wasn't fancy. It was hearty, simple, and built to keep a working man going after long hours in the factory, on the farm, or at the docks. These meals were cheap, filling, and made with whatever was on hand. But as times changed, with fast food, supermarkets, and health trends, many of these dishes disappeared from the family table. Today, we're bringing them back to memory. You might be shocked at which meal nearly every household once relied on. Liver and onions. A dinner of fried beef liver smothered in caramelized onions was once a blue-collar staple. It was packed with iron and protein, perfect for steelworkers or miners. Today, most people wrinkle their nose at the taste. If you thought liver was a tough sell, wait until you hear about the next dish, because not even onions could save it. Chipped beef on toast. This infamous dish got its nickname in the military, SOS, short for stuff on a shingle. Those soldiers used a saltier word. Thin slices of salty dried beef were smothered in white gravy and poured over toast. For working men back home, it became a budget-friendly dinner, especially during wartime shortages. It was salty, filling, and could stretch a little beef a long way. While it wasn't anyone's favorite, it was a reminder that survival sometimes mattered more than taste. But compared to the next dish, chipped beef was practically gourmet. Fried bologna steaks. Bologna may have been the lunchbox king, but for many working families, it also made its way to the dinner table. Thick slices of bologna were fried in a pan until the edges curled up, then served with mustard or slapped between slices of white bread. And if bologna was the poor man's steak, then the next dish was the poor man's roast beef. Meatloaf with saltine crackers. Before breadcrumbs became standard, meatloaf was bulked up with crushed saltine crackers. It was baked with ketchup on top and served in thick slices. Comforting, yes, but now replaced with fancier ground beef dishes. But if meatloaf was about stretching beef, the next dish took it a step further by stretching everything. Goulash. American goulash wasn't like the Hungarian classic. Instead, it was elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and whatever spices were handy. It was one of those one-pot wonders that could feed an army of kids without breaking the bank. For working families, goulash meant plenty of carbs and calories, just what a man needed after burning energy all day. It was simple, hearty, and cheap. And like many Depression-era dinners, it's all but vanished from modern tables. But if you thought pasta and beef were simple, the next dish proves you could skip the beef altogether. Potato soup. Potato soup was the ultimate empty pantry dinner. With nothing but potatoes, onions, a little milk, and maybe a scrap of bacon, families could create a filling meal that stretched for days. Working men loved it because it was hot, heavy, and comforting. Perfect after cold outdoor labor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival food that still carried a sense of warmth. Yet, as plain as potato soup was, the next meal made it look downright fancy. Cornmeal mush with gravy. This dish was about as humble as it gets. Cornmeal mush was cooked like oatmeal, left to cool until firm, then sliced and fried. Served with gravy, or sometimes just butter and salt, it filled stomachs on pennies. Coal miners and farmhands often relied on it, especially in rural areas where cornmeal was plentiful. Today, it's rare to find anyone frying up cornmeal mush for dinner, though its cousin polenta lives on in fancier kitchens. But if cornmeal mush was simple fuel, the next dish was pure protein power. Ham hocks and beans. One of the great pot meals of working-class kitchens, ham hocks and beans were cooked low and slow until the smoky flavor of the hock infused the beans. Served with cornbread, it was a meal built to last. The beauty of this dish was its affordability. A single ham hock, something butchers nearly gave away, could transform a pot of beans into a feast. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hearty enough to keep a man going through the toughest shifts. Cabbage and dumplings. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, cabbage and dumplings were a staple in industrial towns. Boiled cabbage was mixed with soft flour dumplings, sometimes with bits of bacon for flavor, and if cabbage was considered humble, the next dish was downright overlooked. Sardines on crackers. Yes, sardines weren't just for lunch, they were dinner too. Packed with protein, cheap and shelf-stable, they became a go-to meal when money was tight. Served on crackers with mustard or hot sauce, sardines made for a salty, satisfying dinner. But even sardines had more prestige than the final dish in this first half of our list. Boiled cabbage with vinegar. Boiled cabbage might not sound exciting, but it was the centerpiece of many working-class dinners. Cheap, filling, and full of vitamins, it was often served with vinegar for tang and a hunk of bread on the side. It was a survival meal, plain and simple. For immigrant families and working men across the country, boiled cabbage kept the hunger away when little else could. Shepherd's pie, American style. Shepherd's pie might have started as a British dish, but working families in America quickly made it their own. Ground beef replaced lamb, and leftover mashed potatoes were spread across the top like a blanket before baking. But if shepherd's pie was creative, the next dish was downright crafty. Cabbage rolls. Cabbage leaves stuffed with rice, meat, and spices were common among Eastern European immigrants who worked in factories and steel plants. They were cheap to make, filling, and could be cooked in big batches for large families. And speaking of toughness, the next dish was as rugged as it sounds. Scrapple. Born out of Pennsylvania Dutch cooking, scrapple was a brick of pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices pressed together and fried into crispy slices. It was a breakfast food for some, but for many working men, it doubled as dinner with eggs or potatoes on the side. Salisbury steak. Salisbury steak was ground beef dressed up to look like a steak, smothered in gravy and served with mashed potatoes. It was invented during the late 1800s as a health food, but by the mid-20th century, it had become the ultimate working man's dinner. Factories and diners loved serving it because it was cheap and hearty. But once frozen TV dinners claimed Salisbury steak, it lost its home-cooked charm. Still, it was nothing compared to the heartiness of the next dish. Beef stew with root vegetables. Thick, heavy, and filling, beef stew was the definition of a working man's meal. A few chunks of beef, carrots, potatoes, and onions simmered for hours created a dish that could feed a family and keep hunger away for good. But if beef stew was warmth, the next dish was fire. Chili with cornbread. Long before chili cook-offs, chili was a working man's survival food. Ground beef, beans, chili powder, and tomatoes simmered into a spicy stew that filled bellies for pennies. Cornbread stretched the meal even further, turning it into a feast. For men working railroads, oil fields, or cattle ranches, chili wasn't just dinner, it was identity. Everyone had their own version, and it was always bold. Macaroni and tomato juice. Before boxed mac and cheese ruled the shelves, macaroni with tomato juice was a Depression-era staple. Simple, cheap, and filling, it was the kind of dinner that kept families fed when money was scarce. For kids, it was comfort. For adults, it was survival. And while it might sound odd today, back then, it was common enough to be considered normal. But if macaroni and tomato juice was humble, the next dish had real backbone. Pork and beans with bread. Pork and beans might not seem special today, but for working men, it was a staple. The beans provided energy, the pork added flavor, and the bread soaked it all up. Still, if pork and beans were reliable, the next dish was indulgence on a budget. Pot roast. Pot roast was the crown jewel of working-class dinners. A tough cut of beef, carrots, and potatoes were cooked low and slow until tender. It turned cheap meat into something luxurious. And if pot roast was tradition, the next dish was pure American grit. Fried catfish and hush puppies. For men in the South, catfish was more than food. It was a way of life. Freshly caught, battered, and fried, it was served with hush puppies, coleslaw, and maybe a slice of cornbread. Catfish dinners often followed long days on farms or railroads, where food had to be hearty and filling. Today, catfish remains in the South, but the old working man's version has largely faded. Still, no dish summed up the working man's table like the final one. Steak and onions, the real treat. At the top of the list, steak and onions was the ultimate working man's dinner. It wasn't an everyday meal, more of a payday treat. After weeks of cheap cuts and humble dinners, men would finally splurge on a real steak. Grilled or pan-fried with onions, it was simple, bold, and satisfying. For a brief moment, the working man could eat like a king, but as wages changed and diets evolved, steak went from a rare prize to a luxury, and the tradition of celebrating payday with steak slowly disappeared. These 25 working man's dinners weren't gourmet, they weren't fancy, but they fueled generations of workers, families, and communities. Today, they're nearly forgotten, yet each one tells a story of survival, resilience, and the simple meals that kept America running.